Project Hail Mary, $650 million, 96% on Rotten Tomatoes. The internet has officially called it a masterpiece. It's the greatest space movie in years. Maybe ever. Okay, let's talk about that.
Operation Go Home.
Look, the consensus is not wrong on the surface. It is a feel-good sci-fi film. It's big heart, strong lead, visuals hold up on a large screen. Got it. Most people walked out of the theater happy, and the reviews reflect that. Fair enough. Here's the thing. I didn't feel this movie. I read it. Because when you've spent 30 years on set, you stop experiencing a film the way everyone else does. You see the decision, you see the shortcut, you see the moment where somebody in that room knew better and they did it anyway. And that's not a flex, that's actually kind of a curse. And what I read in Project Hail Mary, well, it didn't add up to what everybody's been selling. Not that something was wrong with it. It's not a bad movie. It just didn't work. Not for me, and not as a film.
Apology. Rocky, stay.
I'm Matthew Lawrence. 30 years in the editing room gives you a specific kind of vision, and it does so honestly. There is a cinematography decision in this film that almost nobody is talking about that might be the single most important creative choice in the entire production. There are structural problems keeping this film out of the permanent canon, whether people really want to admit it or not. And there is one benchmark that changes this entire conversation. Stick around and I'll give you my final answer on whether Project Hail Mary clears it at the end. This is the rough cut. Let's get cutting. I want to start with Greig Fraser because this is where the film earns its respect and where almost every review completely misses the conversation. Fraser shot Dune. He has an Oscar. He does not make accidental decisions, and his choice here, warm, amber, analog, the color of a kitchen light at 10 p.m. Not cold, not vast, and not indifferent, warm. And honestly, it was the right call. For the story that they were telling, a cold, sterile palette would have just been the wrong film. The humor needed warmth. The friendship needed warmth. Fraser understood the assignment. But here's where it gets interesting, though. That same decision, the correct one, is also the one thing that cost this film any chance at greatness. Because warmth is safety. Interstellar was never safe. That film is the ceiling of the genre, not a comparison or not a measuring stick. It's a watermark. And what I saw in Project Hail Mary is a film that made every right decision and never once scared itself into something great. Here is my position, and I will stand on it. Every space film made after 2014, and maybe even every one before it, gets measured against Interstellar. Not because I said so, because Interstellar is what happens when a filmmaker commits completely to the weight of a premise and doesn't flinch once. No shortcuts, no safety net, no humor doing the heavy lifting. Nolan made a demand of his audience, and they showed up for it. 2001 is up there. Gravity, Arrival. Those films are the ceiling. Not a comparison, not a measuring stick, a watermark. So throughout this review, I'm holding Project Mary up against that watermark. Not to be unfair to this film, but because if you want to sit in the permanent canon of great space cinema, well, you need to understand the distance between a film that made the right decisions and a film that was brave enough to make the hard ones. Pay attention as we go through this, not just to where Project Hail Mary falls short, but why? Because the gap between a very good commercial film and an actual masterpiece is almost always a series of small decisions all made in the same direction. You are going to start seeing that pattern. And that pattern starts in the very first scene, with a structural choice that is simultaneously the film's most clever idea and its most expensive mistake. The amnesia device is clever, I will give them that. Dropping Ryland Grace into a spacecraft with no memory, letting the character and the audience piece together what happened at the same time, that is a legitimate structural choice. It gives the filmmakers a blank slate, which in the hands of a good writer is actually a powerful tool. And there is a payoff buried in it that I do genuinely respect. Now, spoiler warning right here. When you finally find out that he didn't volunteer, that he was selfish, that they literally had to put him under against his will to get him on that ship, well, that's pretty good irony. The man who wanted nothing to do with the mission ends up being the only one who can finish it. Well, that works. But here's the filmmaker's problem with it. That nonlinear structure, it creates an emotional distance at the exact moment the film needs you completely locked in. Interstellar opens with Cooper on a farm watching a drone, and in exactly 3 minutes, you know who he is, what he loves, and what he's about to lose. Project Hail Mary opens with a man who doesn't know who he is. And when the film is 2 hours and 36 minutes long and asking you to emotionally invest in one man alone in space, well, that distance is not a minor issue. It compounds. And it gets compounded further by a problem that every science-heavy film faces. And honestly, one that Spielberg solved better than anyone in 1993, yet most directors, they still haven't figured it out. Every science-heavy film has what I call the nerd dump. Nerd! Nerd! The moment the story stops cold to deliver a technical briefing because, well, the audience has no hope of following the premise without a roadmap. Project Hail Mary actually has a decent solution for it. Gosling plays a science teacher, so the classroom setting lets the exposition land the same way it lands for the kids in the scene. You are a student. He is explaining astrophage, and it works. Spielberg did a version of this in Jurassic Park with the park ride sequence, where he explained an entire scientific premise and made it feel like an attraction rather than a lecture. That's a hard thing to do, and Project Hail Mary gets credit for the classroom idea. The problem is this film has multiple nerd dumps across the entire runtime. Every time the story builds momentum, there's another briefing. And in a film already pushing 2.5 hours, well, that's a pacing tax you keep paying again and again and again. Interstellar solved this by making the science inseparable from what Cooper was feeling emotionally. The science is the story. Project Hail Mary treats the science like an interruption. There is a meaningful difference. Now, some of those interruptions you'll forgive, because the whole bet this film is making is that the lead performance will carry you through. So let's talk about that bet. Gosling has a genuinely difficult job in this film. He is carrying the entire first act alone, reacting to nothing. There are moments where he absolutely pulls it off, and I want to give him credit for that. But here's my honest problem. There are too many moments where I can see Ryan Gosling being Ryan Gosling. The glasses adjustment, the shoulder glance, the little comedic reaction face. We call that mugging in the industry, and once you see it, well, you can't unsee it. But here's the filmmaker's read on that. I don't think that's on Gosling. I think that's on the material. When blockbuster comedy is your primary emotional engine, well, you're asking your lead to deliver jokes and carry existential weight in the same scene. That is a system problem. The script asked him to be funny first and human second. And that's a constraint nobody climbs out of clean. My standard for great film acting is simple. Are you watching the character or are you watching the actor? The benchmark? Tom Hanks in Forrest Gump. You completely forget you're watching Tom Hanks. He disappeared into that role so entirely that you were just watching a man live his life. That is the ceiling. The more direct comparison here, though, the one that actually matters, is Matt Damon in The Martian. Same source author, Andy Weir. Same premise, one man alone using science to survive, carrying the whole film on his back. Well, Damon, he disappeared. Watney felt real. Not because Damon is a better actor than Gosling, but because The Martian didn't ask him to mug. It let him be desperate and funny at the same time without choosing one over the other. Gosling, he never got that permission. And for a film staking everything on one man alone in space, well, that's a problem the script created and the performance had to absorb. Which brings me to the single hardest production challenge in the entire film, and the one place the team actually surprised me. Let's be honest about what they were asking the audience to do here. Form a genuine emotional bond with a non-humanoid CGI alien that communicates entirely through tones and light patterns. No face, no words, no shared cultural reference. That is an enormous task, and I want to give credit where it's due. The audio work on Rocky is legitimately impressive. The design team built an emotional language for a being with no mouth, and those sounds carry more weight than the animation does. When Rocky panics, you feel it in the sound before you've even processed it visually. Human beings connect through audio first, and the team understood that. And for stretches of this film, well, it works. But here's where I have to be honest, because the same system that narrowed Gosling's range ended up doing the same thing to Rocky. The blockbuster framework needed Rocky to be likable, accessible, safe. And somewhere in that mandate, I felt like they stopped building a character and they started building a product. And Rocky isn't operating in a vacuum here. This film released into a world where Grogu already exists, where audiences have already given their hearts to a small, strange, nonverbal creature and had that relationship earned over multiple seasons of careful, patient storytelling. Rocky? Well, he had 2.5 hours. And for most of it, well, he was the comic relief, just the sidekick, present when needed and helpful when the plot required it. You liked him without ever really feeling him, but that's not a character. That's a toy waiting to be manufactured. R2-D2 was the same device 50 years ago. The difference is, Star Wars never pretended R2-D2 was the emotional center of the story. Project Hail Mary, though, needed Rocky to be just that, even though the framework they built him inside made that almost impossible. The audio team gave him a soul. The visual execution gave him a personality. Those are not the same thing. And the gap between them is the same gap we keep finding in this film. Every correct decision quietly adding up to something just short of great. This is my biggest critique, full stop. I was not expecting how hard this film leans into humor, and I want to give you the filmmaker's read on what that humor is actually doing structurally, because it is intentional. Humor lowers the audience's defenses. It creates buy-in without requiring you to earn it through genuine emotional construction. Get people laughing in the first 20 minutes, and they will follow you almost anywhere. Lord and Miller know this well. Their entire filmography is built on it, and they are genuinely good at it. The Lego Movie, Spider-Verse, very funny. But here is the cost when you apply that device to a film about one man trying to save 8 billion people. Because here's the thing, Andy Weir already solved this problem. The Martian is the same author, the same archetype, the same survival premise, and Weir's humor in that book is sparse, almost stingy with it. When it lands, well, it lands hard because you feel the person underneath it. The comedy isn't the engine, it's the relief valve. Project Hail Mary ran that engine hot for 2.5 hours straight. And when you commit that fully to the comedic lane, you spend down the emotional currency you were saving for the moments that actually matter. Interstellar never used humor as a shortcut, not once. Nolan committed to the weight from the very first frame, and the result was a film that made a real demand of its audience. Project Hail Mary made a different choice, the safer choice. And that choice isn't wrong for what it was trying to be, a commercial blockbuster that plays to a wide audience. Well, that's a legitimate goal. The problem is you can't build that system and then ask the same film to also break your heart. The two mandates kind of cancel each other out. It's not a writing problem, and it's not a directing problem. That's a structural commitment, made early, locked in, and paid for in the end, which is what we're going to look at next. 2 hours and 36 minutes. And I want to be precise about why that's a problem, because it's not that the story lacks content for the runtime. It doesn't. The issue is the middle act. You spend close to an hour in one location with two characters, and at the end of that hour, I did not feel closer to either of them than I did going in. That's a structural failure. A film earns its runtime when every scene is doing multiple things simultaneously, advancing plot, deepening character, raising stakes. Too much of that middle act was doing one thing when it needed to be doing three. But here's what I want to point your attention to, because I think it tells you something about exactly who this film was made for. Watch the opening. I mean, really watch it. I was clocking the cuts, and there are sequences in those first few minutes running at roughly 1 second per cut. Fast interchanges, overlapping action, sensory input stacked so quickly, well, you barely process one thing before the next arrives. And sitting there watching it, I recognized the pattern immediately because I've seen it 1,000 times. Not in film, but on a screen. That opening is engineered like a YouTube hook. Get him in the first 30 seconds or you've lost him. Quick cuts to confirm the click, fast movement to hold the eye, enough visual stimulation to override the instinct to scroll. And then once they have you, okay, now we'll tell you the story. Now we'll slow down. I'm not going to tell you that was an accident because Lord and Miller are too smart for accidents. But what it tells me is the film knew exactly what kind of an audience it was chasing. An audience trained on 30-second clips. An audience that needs to be captured before it can be held. That's a legitimate creative strategy. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying Nolan didn't do it. Kubrick never would have. And the distance between those two approaches is the distance between a film that grabs you and a film that stays with you. Project Hail Mary grabs you, I'll give it that. What it couldn't do was hold on. The ending is predictable, not in the cheap sense, in the structural sense. The kind of predictable where you can feel the machinery moving before it arrives. And the emotional logic, well, it falls apart under any real scrutiny. Ryland Grace, the man so selfish he had to literally be sedated and loaded onto a spacecraft against his will, decides at the very end to abandon 8 billion people to stay behind with his alien friend. And I sat there thinking, that's what I waited 2.5 hours for? Not a decision that broke him, not a sacrifice that cost him something he couldn't bear to lose, a man choosing to go save his friend. Which I understand the argument the film was making, I do. But the middle act was supposed to build that bond to the point where the choice was devastating. Well, it didn't do that job. So when the moment arrived, I felt the mechanics of it. I felt the script reaching for emotion that it hadn't earned. When you step outside the story at the exact moment the filmmaker needs you deepest inside it, that's the failure state. There's no other word for it. So the benchmark. We've been in this room long enough. Let's answer the question. Here's where I land. Project Hail Mary is a good film. I want to be precise about that. But good is not a consolation prize. It is a well-crafted, well-performed, commercially intelligent piece of filmmaking. Greg Fraser made the right call with that warm palette. The amnesia structure, well, it's smarter than it first appears. And the audio work on Rocky is some of the most creative sound design I've heard in years. And these are not small things. These are genuine achievements. But good is not the ceiling. And that is the actual verdict. Not that Project Hail Mary failed, it's that it succeeded at exactly the level it aimed for. Every decision in this film was the correct decision for a commercial blockbuster. The warm palette, the comedy as the primary emotional device, the YouTube-paced opening to capture the audience before it settled in, the friendship arc built on charm instead of cost. Every single one of those was the right call for the film they were making. And every single one of those is exactly why it can't touch the films we're talking about when we talk about the ceiling of the genre. Because the ceiling isn't a film that made the right decisions. The ceiling is a film that scared itself into the right decisions. Nolan didn't play it safe. Kubrick never played it safe. The films that live up there, they made choices that could have destroyed them. And those choices are why we're still talking about them. Project Hail Mary never scared itself into anything. It committed to humor when stakes required silence. It committed to warmth when the void required weight. It gave Ryan Gosling a blockbuster device when it needed to give him a human being in crisis. It built a bond that was supposed to justify a man sacrificing everything, and when that moment came, I felt the machinery of it. I didn't feel him. One and done for me. I watched it, and I won't again. Not because it's a bad film, because it's a complete one. It gave me everything it had on the first viewing, and there's really nothing left to find. The films that belong in my canon, well, they're different every time you watch them, because you're different every time you watch them. That's the test. And Project Hail Mary doesn't pass it. That's the distance, not a category score, not a checklist. The distance between a film that grabs you and a film that stays with you. Project Hail Mary grabbed me, it just couldn't hold on. I'm Matthew Lawrence. This has been The Rough Cut, a filmmaker's perspective with no apologies. If you made it this far, drop something in the comments. Tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me what I missed. I genuinely want to know. It's not a bit. If this kind of breakdown is what you came for, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because the next film I'm cutting into is going to test everything I just said about that ceiling. And I think you're going to want to be in the room for that one. I'll see you in the edit room.